Hi, everyone. It's such a thrill for me to be here on stage with Joe. I read his book last year and reviewed it, and it was my book of 2024. You must read it. It followed on from, I remember Joe's first book, 2006 it came out, White Bicycles. And I was a bookseller in London, and we sold it so much. Everybody was fascinated by this kind of memoir about the music from the 1960s. And I thought Joe might follow up with a book about the music of the 1970s, but he didn't. He has been on this epic book writing journey for the new one, which came out last year. Joe, why did you choose to write this huge history of global music, and tell us about it?
Well, there were a number of reasons, but and when I finished it, the publisher suggested I write a little preface to kind of introduce the book, and I resisted for a while. I wanted people to be thrown right in at the deep end, but I'm glad I did in the end, and I'm just going to read a little bit of it, which I think explains an answer to that question. Late one afternoon in 1999 in New Orleans, I found myself handing out $20 bills to a group of local horn players who were adding parts to an album called Mardi Gras Mambo by the Cuban all-star group Cubanismo, who we heard earlier playing some Latin music when you were coming in. To Jesus Alemany, the group's leader, their playing was never quite right, and he kept demanding retake after retake. The group would roll their eyes, check their watches, mutter about having to get home to change before a gig that night, and I would bribe them to stick with it for another 15 minutes. The problem was that they laid back on the beat with a sensual, big, easy cool. Cubans, on the other hand, generate their sexy grooves by sticking to the task with rigor, the rhythm section meshing together with the precision of a Swiss watch. When we finally got a take that made Jesus, if not entirely happy, at least ready to move on, I took a moment to ponder what I had just witnessed. The album was conceived as a celebration of links between the musical cultures of New Orleans and Havana. Both were born in Africa, then shaped by colonial slavery, and had borrowed freely from each other over the centuries. How did their rhythmic sensibilities come to be so different? I parked that question in the back of my mind. One day, I thought, I'd look for the answer. The answers I found involved both Dizzy Gillespie and a 1552 Islamophobic edict by the King of Spain, which seemed like a pretty good start, so I decided to keep going. Along the way, I discovered among many other things, why the Soviets hated Bulgarian women's choirs, that Afrobeat began with a subscription to an American jazz magazine, why so many artists from Caetano Veloso and Gilberto Gil to Ivo Popazov and Fela Kuti ended up in prison because of their music, how Frank Sinatra owed his career to a French tango singer from Buenos Aires, and why Charles Dickens wrote an angry polemic about a Zulu choir who visited London in 1853. This is not an academic book. It travels back in history and across the globe, from Africa to the Caribbean and Latin America, and through Europe to South Asia and back, following the circular flows of musical influence and the interconnectedness of cultures. Rhythms get traced back to their roots, then forward to show how they shape so much of the music we all know so well. This journey begins, but this journey brings to life the backstories and the personalities at the heart of the process, characters as colorful and unforgettable as the stars of Western popular music.
Thank you. I mean, that gives us an idea about the seeds of the book, but I also have to tell you, the book is over 900 pages long.
Well, actually 833 of text.
And Joe says in the book, if you buy a copy, you may need a Sherpa to carry it home. It's a huge book. Tell us a bit about the structure of how you laid it out.
Well, I don't know. I guess to me, what I'm writing about is the music that we in the so-called West know the best, but don't know anything about. Everybody likes reggae and Latin music and Brazilian samba and Argentine tango and Eastern European gypsy music and Indian music, of course. And so the structure of the book is to take each of those styles, look at how they entered our world and where they began in ways that we don't know, very few people know. I spent 17 years reading often very academic books and culling them and pulling out the gems, the kind of anecdotal gems and the personalities that shine. And that's the structure. We go through each of those styles that people know, and then we get to the end.
And what about how you began? I mean, when we think of music producers, it's such a grand job. But did you start off as a musician yourself, or how did your career begin? What were the early stages?
I'm pretty old, and the music business has changed immensely since I began. And I get young musicians and fans coming up to me and asking, "Oh my God, the sound you got on that Nick Drake record is so fantastic. How did you do that?" And before you became a producer, were you a musician or were you an engineer? Which is pretty much what most producers these days are. And I said, neither. And he said, "What do you mean? How could you become a producer if you weren't one, And I said, well, like many producers in the past, I just listened. That was my job, to listen, to have a judgment and a feeling about the music I heard, to try and bring people together in the studio and encourage them and guide them in a way to come up with the best historical record of that moment in time, that music. And the greatest music that people still buy today is usually the music that was recorded in a studio, everybody together, looking at each other, responding to each other in a moment of time. It's a frozen moment of time. In a way, the most vivid piercing of the veil of time to understand the past is a record. And that was always my feeling as a producer, was I wanted to make records that I could still enjoy 50 years later. And, I often do listen to my own records.
As we all do. You say in the book that as a producer, you never felt limited by genre or style. So when opportunities arose to work with Jamaican, South African, Indian musicians, you took them eagerly in the 60s and 70s. Was that a golden era?
Well, yeah, I guess it was. In a way, technology has, this is a whole other subject, I won't spend very long, but just the recording technology that started back in the late 19th century really got going in the late 20s when electronic recording began. And people began listening to records that could really give you the feeling of music and how it felt as it was played. And during the time that I started in the 60s with a 1/4-inch tape that was either mono or stereo, and within 10 years, there were 24-track tapes, so you could do all this overdubbing and, using many different tracks. And technology has been the servant of music for many years, and allowing incredibly vivid recordings to appear. And then, one way of looking at it is a bit like that, the broom in Fantasia, that I don't know if you've seen the Disney film Fantasia, but he tells the broom to go carry water from the cellar, and the broom just won't stop and floods the whole land with water because it takes over. And I think technology a bit now has taken over, and music is now almost the servant of technology. But for my period of time as a producer, technology was a wonderful tool to preserve the past for us in the present.
I'd like us, if we've got time a bit later, to come back to technology, because we've been having a chat about that here at the festival. But I'd like to us to talk about Indian music now, because obviously we're here in Jaipur. And
to talk about
Indian music and the...
Okay, well, were you going to go to South Africa first?
I think we were going to come to South Africa after,
Okay,
but we can.
okay. No, that's fine.
I wondered if we could start with Norwegian wood.
Well, actually, let's. I think the answer to the original. I'm sorry. Was that one of the ways I've sort of explained in words what this book is about, but in a way, it really comes down to the sound of music. And people say that the book keeps sending them to YouTube and to Spotify to hear things that I talk about. And I think one of the best ways to explain what this book is about is a sequence of track, very just little fragments we're going to play of some tracks, starting with, I think all of you have probably seen The Lion King. And in The Lion King, there's a song, which is one of the most famous songs of the 20th century. It's been a hit, #1 record in France, Britain, America, maybe even in India, I don't know, many times over the years. And can we hear it? That is The Lion Sleeps Tonight, of course, the original hit version by the Tokens. And that was recorded in 1960. And they were signed by RCA Victor. They went to the studio and they told the producer that their first recording they wanted to do was a song called Whim Away, which they knew from Pete Seeger, who's the most famous American folk singer of the 20th century, and a wonderful guy, an incredible talent. And he and his group, the Weavers, their showstopper, the big number of their concerts, was a folk song, a South African folk song that they'd learned called Whim Away, which sounded like this. And Pete Seeger learned that song because a South African record company called Gallo Records sent a box of 78s in 1947 to Decca Records in New York because they were representing Decca in South Africa, and they hoped that Decca might release some of their records in America. Decca completely ignored the box, never opened it, never listened to any of the records. And one day, Alan Lomax, who was a famous folklorist, noticed the box. He was there working on a project for Decca. And he took the box home to an apartment in New York that he shared with Pete Seeger. And they started listening to these records. And they heard this record. That record is called Mbube, which means lion, and it was recorded by Solomon Linda and the original Evening Birds in 1938 and was released the day that Hitler invaded Poland. And it became the biggest selling record in South Africa over the next 10 years. And the whole form of Zulu traditional singing that is represented on that record became called Mbube. And Solomon Linda became a star. He was, very celebrated, but he had to keep his day job, which was packing records in the Gallo Records warehouse, because he wasn't allowed to live. A musician was not a recognized job description in South Africa in the apartheid era. And he eventually went out of favor and became very poor and lived a very simple life. And during all those years when Pete Seeger was touring and this record got into the top 10, Wimaway got into the top 10 in America, and then Lion Sleeps Tonight got to #1 in America, and Disney then put Lion Sleeps Tonight into their film, not one penny of royalties passed to Solomon Linda, whose falsetto improvisation created that great hook of a melody, which became one of the most famous hooks in music in the 20th century. And long after he died, finally there was some restitution, and his niece, who was living in poverty, got a check for some 7 figures of back royalties that had been earned. But it sort of represents this complicated relationship between traditional music from around the world and the way the music industry, in a way, in the West, cherry picks wonderful things, rhythms, melodies, words. And at the same time, all those groups that used to compete on the weekends in the 1930s in Johannesburg, of which Solomon Linda was a champion, they listened to the Mills Brothers, the American harmony group, and they listened to Benny Goodman records, and they listened to Duke Ellington records, and they loved American jazz, and it really influenced them. So the theme of the book, in a way, is this back and forth, the fact that nothing is pure, everything is connected. There is no pure traditional music. Anyway, on that note, and of course, South Africa is chapter 1 and the kind of poster boy for this process, the way Paul Simon went to and recorded Graceland in South Africa, the fame of Miriam Makeba and the Click Song and Pata Pata and Hugh Masekela, and so much music that has crossed back and forth. It's a mixture of South African traditions and American. And then let's go to India.
Well, this is really how the book reads. You end up down 1,001 rabbit holes, written very, very eloquently, but on every single page. And you read, and then you just want to learn more. It's just the most incredible, not introduction, because it's much, much more than an introduction, but it's a wonderful book, and it's such a good description. I would like us to get to Indian music because we're rattling along. We were talking about Norwegian wood. Can you maybe start us off there?
Well, should we hear? This is when you talk about India and its relationship to the Western music. This is the first thing people think of.
I wanted a girl, or should I say, she wanted me. She showed me her room, isn't it good? Norwegian wood. She asked me to stay and she told me to sit.
And yes, everybody, that is a sitar. And it was being played by George Harrison. And the story of how that came to be starts in the summer of 1965 in Zsa Zsa Gabor's vast black bathtub in Beverly Hills.
It's a picture.
The Beatles were on this big tour, which included their famous Shea Stadium concert. And they knew that they'd need some rest and relaxation at some point. So they rented Zsa Zsa Gabor's mansion in Beverly Hills for a week. And they flew to Los Angeles. And every night there was parties, there was booze, there was food, there was girls, there were drugs. It was just sybaritic, time for them to relax. And they invited all musical friends and celebrities and movie stars, and everybody came to these parties. And one night, George Harrison and John Lennon ended up out of their heads on LSD, lying in Zsa Zsa's bathtub with no water. It was dry. And on the edge of the bathtub, with their legs up on the side of the bathtub, holding guitars, were Roger McGuinn and David Crosby of the Byrds, who they had become friends with. And Crosby and McGuinn had become obsessed with Indian music because their rehearsal studio, where they created their sound, they invented that sound of Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, which was the Byrds' first hit, all was done in this studio, which belonged to a record company that was Ravi Shankar's record label in America. And one night they got stoned, and someone put on a test pressing of the new Ravi Shankar record. And David Crosby and Roger McGuinn went berserk. They thought this was the greatest thing they'd ever heard. David Crosby grabbed the test pressing and ran out the door, took it home, and spent the next 3 days listening to it over and over. And McGuinn was fascinated because he played a 12-string guitar, which resonated with the way the strings resonated in sympathy with what the melody strings. And what he heard in the sitar reminded him of the structure of his 12-string guitar, the sound that he got from his 12-string. And without knowing a great deal, they still understood that Indian music had a completely different melodic and harmonic basis than Western music. That it was mostly pentatonic, 5-note scales. The scales were not the same as do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That the rhythm went in cycles of 12 and 16 and other numbers of beats. They understood this much, and they stood on the edge of Zsa Zsa Gabor's bathtub, and they played their guitar trying to imitate Ravi Shankar's sitar, and just telling George and John, you've got to listen to this guy, you've got to listen to this music. And so when the Beatles went back to London in the autumn, George Harrison went out from the EMI Records office. Some of you might know it's in Manchester Square, just off Oxford Street, and just near the HMV record store. And he walked in, he bought all the Ravi Shankar LPs they had, took them home, listened to them all. And then he came back to Oxford Street, went to India Craft, and bought a sitar with an instruction book. And when they went into the studio to start recording the new album, when John Lennon was playing Norwegian Wood, he turned to George and he said, hey, George, why don't you try shadowing the melody with that Indian thingy of yours? And that's how you get to that record that you just heard. And of course, that was just the beginning. George eventually became great friends of Ravi Shankar, studied the sitar, and that process of studying the sitar, even though he didn't become an accomplished sitarist, transformed the way he played the guitar. And in the book, I write about all the tremendous amount of influence, starting in the 60s, that Indian music had on Western music. John Coltrane, his music was transformed by his love for Indian music and his realization that the keys on the piano and the frets on the guitar are not absolute, that they're just a Western curiosity, that the rest of the world has so many different ways of playing scales, and the fluidity of Indian music transformed Coltrane's way of looking at music. Philip Glass and the minimalist modern music was, again, shaped by Philip Glass's relationship with Ala Raka and his understanding of the cyclical nature of these rhythmic patterns. And so much that was shaped over the years by Indian music. And I talk in the book, I go back to explain Ravi Shankar's backstory about his brother who had a troupe of Indian musicians and dancers who toured Europe in the 1920s. And Ravi Shankar was a young boy star dancer who sat on the lap of movie stars in Hollywood when he was 12, and how he eventually became a serious student at the Gharana of Aladdin Khan, and how he met Yehudi Menuhin, who brought him to the West. And we go on to the stories of Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan and Bollywood and all this stuff. I go into, not in great depth, and I'm sure not to a really thorough extent, but then eventually I get to the reason that we played Three Little Birds as you were coming in by Bob Marley. We're not talking about reggae in Jamaica, although I have a chapter about it in the book. But we played that in honor of John Singh, who it was his favorite song, and it was played at his funeral. And John and Faith Singh are, as it was acknowledged at the beginning of this festival, it was their idea, the initial germ of the idea of this festival, this literary festival. And they've had so many ideas, starting with Anoki. But what was fascinating about, and what I was fascinated with, and what led me to a friendship with John, was the way that he applied what he and Faith had discovered about the way to work with Indian Rajasthani traditions in hand block printing and textiles, applied to music as a way to preserve and revive Rajasthani musical traditions. And so I'm just going to read a short passage that I wrote. In 2011, I traveled with Singh to a meeting with members of the Manganyar musical clan in a village near Jaisalmer in the west of the state. The busiest Rajasthani musicians are either Langas or Manganyars, networks of Muslim performers who have for centuries kept the family histories of Hindu farmers performing ritual music at all their births, weddings, and deaths. John organized these get-togethers so that musicians could compare notes, hear and encourage young musicians, and air shared problems. Those days resonate in my memory for the relaxed camaraderie, the brilliant music, the astonishing skills shown by pre-teen virtuosos, the delicious food scooped out of buckets onto tin plates, and the delicate light over the desert in the early evenings.
Joe, could you hold your microphone a bit closer?
Okay. On the final night, we were joined by a delegation of the Manganyar's employers, Hindu farmers, whose links to the musicians extend back many generations. In what John told me was a first, they sat with the musicians and serenaded them with traditional songs of their own, a perfect coda to the preceding days and to the work of the JVF has done to strengthen the ancient bonds holding these communities together in the face of sectarianism and the impatient energies of modernity. The Thar Desert around Jaisalmer has been at the front line of religious and cultural confrontation for millennia, crossed and recrossed by invading and defending armies. Many of the Mangagnars I met there have traversed it to board a plane bound for Europe or America, where they command art center and festival stages with the same relaxed confidence they demonstrate when singing the history of a landowning family at a wedding. The tourist brochure cliché about India is that it is timeless. While resisting the reductive simplicity of that slogan, I couldn't help but ponder the fact that like these Mangagnars, I couldn't help but ponder the fact that it was groups very much like these Mangagnars who headed west 1,600 years ago and would end up completely reshaping European musical culture. And what I'm talking about there is a moment that's recorded in Persian historical epics when a Persian king wrote a letter to his Mughal father-in-law saying, Rajasthan, you've got lots of musicians. We don't have any musicians. Send us musicians. And 10,000 musicians, according to this record, traveled from Rajasthan to Persia. And they didn't really get along with the king there. He didn't like their attitude because he expected them to be farmers, but they'd never been farmers in India. They were from a different caste, a different profession. And so they just kept moving west through Armenia, through Turkey, through Greece, up into the Balkans. And everywhere they went, they learned the local music and they played it better than the locals. And they transformed it. And when they got into Europe, they learned over the years that the best answer to the question, who are you? Where are you from? If they said Egypt, they got a smile and a welcome. That was much more simple. People romanticized Egypt. They loved Egypt. So if you said you were from Egypt, that was a good answer. And the slang of the time meant that over the years, being from Egypt became gypsies. They were Egyptians, they were gypsies. And so, there's a whole section in the book where I talk about the way so-called gypsies, who we now call Roma, of course, transformed classical music. Franz Liszt, his whole performing style was based on a man called János Bihari, who was a Roma violinist that he met in Hungary. And eventually we get to the traveling life of the Roma in Western Europe came to an end with World War I because the trenches took up all the land where they used to roam. And they ended up outside Paris. And one of the children born there to a musical family became a king of the guitar named Django Reinhardt, who transformed not only Balkan music and European music and classical music, but Django defined jazz guitar. And he became not only a big star in France in the 30s, but amazingly a star during the German occupation when they were sending Roma to extermination camps. The Germans decided that jazz, gypsy jazz, was a good soundtrack for Paris because they considered Paris to be the whorehouse of the Wehrmacht. But his music expressed something that the French made him a hero. It kept their hopes alive. He had this one great track that he recorded. I don't know if we have time to play it.
We're going to have this
Maybe not.
little track, and then we're going to go to questions.
Yeah.
We'll start.
Just a snatch, and then we'll fade it out. Okay, that's Django.
I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? I have 12 other questions to ask, but... We've got about 8 minutes left. I hope that while we've been having our discussion, you've been thinking about questions. If you could raise your hands, we've got roaming mics to come round. ask Joe anything about music. Okay, lady at the front here, please, in the red top. Thank you.
I've just heard you, and this looks like there's so much of research that's gone on, and since you're in production, I just wanted to know, have your comment on what's happening to how much of technology today does it like impact, hinder, or does it uplift? Because I do feel a lot of times now when I see stage shows, there is tracks and there are people dancing. What's happening to that, that spontaneity of authentic music with band and the ability for us to hear the same track in a little different way every time it's presented authentically, because it's a band playing. So you have a capacity to bring on some kind of an inspirational change. So does technology impact it, and how do we use it today? Like, how is it?
That's a great question.
Thank you. It's a difficult question because if I criticize, for me, if I'm listening to music, I think 99% of what I listen to does not use a drum machine. It uses people actually playing at the same time, in the same room, responding to each other. And when I hear, ever since my wife Andrea and I have been in India, we came a week before, and it's been kind of a shock almost every time we've heard even the most wonderful traditional music, there's an electronic tambura, which doesn't actually distort the rhythm, but it's a little strange. It adds a kind of element that, the first two performances we heard here on the lawn, the first day, a wonderful singer, but with a backing track, and the second day, the Carnatic Quartet interacting, playing. To me, it was a completely different experience listening to that music. And I think, but many people have grown up dancing to and listening to this absolutely rigorous machine-generated beat. And me sitting here is not going to change that. But I do think, I think that I hope that people reading the book or people listening to older recordings or classic recordings will understand this joy and this wonderful quality that comes when you are not in any way tied to the technology. That's all I.
Thank you. Right. Gentleman there in the blue shirt.
In a sense, you've been talking about how music moves across the world. Is appropriation even a word, and is it a bad word?
Great question.
Well, the first example that I showed of The Lion Sleeps Tonight, that is a classic example of appropriation, which is ironic because, Lion Sleeps Tonight is a great record. Whim Away was a great performance by Pete Seeger and the Weavers. It's joyful. It brings so much to so many people, but they didn't pay for it, and they should have. And I think that is appropriation. And I think it's ironic that the man most accused of appropriation, Paul Simon, for his Graceland project, actually paid everybody really fairly and shared the copyrights with the local musicians who helped him compose songs. And I think the truth is, going back to Rajasthani musicians in Persia in the 5th century, every music is mongrel. Every music is a mixture. And, we talked before about one of the extraordinary examples of what happened when records started sounding good and being shipped all over the world. The Hawaiian guitar was something very local to a little island in the Pacific. Somebody discovered you could put it flat on your lap and slide a bar along it, tune it in an open tuning. And every country in the world appropriated it. India, Mohan Bhatt has created a whole, subculture of classical Indian music using the Hawaiian guitar. Is that appropriation? I think this is just a natural process, but compositions should be paid for.
Absolutely. There's a man at the back in a black blazer, I think.
Hi, is your book meant to be read as a narrative, as in I just read through, or should I have YouTube and Spotify and just pause and use it as a reference book to go through? What was your intention for your ideal reader?
I'm sorry, I didn't quite...
When you wrote the book, did you intend people to read through it, or would you like them to listen to a soundtrack as they were going through it, perhaps a Spotify?
I'm a bit ashamed to say that in the front of the book, by the way, the book, we sent books, my publisher sent books, both my first book and this book, to Jaipur, but somehow they haven't arrived. So there are no books to buy or to sign, but it's on Amazon and can be bought that way.
And in all good independent bookshops around the world. Do buy it.
Yes, I hope it will be in independent bookshops. As I say, I'm ashamed to say that in the front of the book, opposite the contents page, I have a little paragraph which says, if you go to my website, you will find a curated playlist that you can follow as you read the book. The whole process of me reading the audio book, of getting the book finished, of touring to promote the book has been so much more time-consuming than I expected, that the curated playlist is still a work in progress, but it will be there. That is my intention, that readers can follow on my website and see every piece of music that I refer to in the book. You can click and find it.
Lady here in the green, please. Thank you.
It's such a great day to think about John, and Faith is here. And we have shared a beautiful relationship, and even on the music and dance. But I want to tell you something very special. Your book has not come, but mine is here to gift it to you, which is Where Silence Sings, a music book and dance book on the desert. For I feel what do you say about the visual appeal of Rajasthan's music and the visual appeal of the Rajasthan's music? What do you think about the visual appeal of the Rajasthan's music? Their turban, their dresses, which add to their talent, and also improvisation in the Indian classical music.
Thank you so much. We've been buzzed like a game show, but if you could just quickly say, what do you find
very
about
quickly,
the visual
I have
element?
to say that, as my wife will confirm, I'm a hearing audio guy. I'm not a good visual guy. So I love the costumes, but I have very little opinion about them or knowledge of them. And so that's just, my whole life has been focused on my ears more than my eyes.
Thank you. And improvisation. Can we thank Joe?